We're way ahead of China in any space endeavor. We need to make sure we stay ahead. We've got to make sure that we can counter their capability, but also prevent them from using, space as a domain in any future conflict.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today we are blasting off into the great beyond for a look at a critical domain for global security, international cooperation, and scientific discovery: outer space. A 1967 UN space treaty was supposed to keep space peaceful, but amid rising global tensions, U.S. space and intelligence experts warn our adversaries may soon renege on that agreement, turning the final frontier into the next battleground for geopolitical conflict. So today, we are talking with someone who understands that risk and knows space better than anyone in Congress, Senator Mark Kelly. Late this summer, Kelly's name was floated as being on the short list for Kamala Harris's VP pick, but when I spoke with him, he was best known for a different kind of floating, logging more than 50 days in low Earth orbit. The former NASA astronaut and Space Shuttle commander currently sits on the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services Committees, and we are talking all about the future of U.S. space policy. But first,
we copy you down, Eagle.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. And we're getting a picture on the TV.
On July 20, 1969, millions of people around the world watched as Neil Armstrong became the first human to step onto the moon, marking America's victory in the space race against the Soviet Union.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
50 years later, in 2019, another lunar milestone unfolded on TV when China became the first and still only country to land a probe on the far side of the moon.
This lunar mission marks a milestone for the nation's space industry.
In June, China's Chang'e 6 mission went even further, returning samples from the same region that will help scientists understand the evolution of our solar system. It was a big victory. President Xi Jinping's eternal dream of making China a leading space power, challenging Russian and U.S. dominance. So are we in a new space race with Beijing? And if so, who's winning? China has poured massive resources into its space program in recent years. In 2013, it completed a robotic moon landing. In 2020, it sent a rover to Mars. And in 2022, it built its space station, Tiangong, after they were banned from the ISS. Meanwhile, the United States has been building up its commercial space industry as private companies have lowered the cost of missions with innovations like reusable rockets, which are pretty cool. In 2026, NASA will partner with SpaceX for the Artemis 3 mission, which plans to send humans to the lunar South Pole, where water has been detected. But China's space program is just getting started. It has a goal of sending astronauts to the moon by 2030 and building a lunar base with Russia by 2035. And U.S. officials worry that China's space program is more directly tied to its military than it's letting on.
We believe that a lot of their so-called civilian space program is a military program. And I think, in effect, we are in a race.
The 1967 UN Space Treaty bans nuclear weapons in space, seems sensible, and says no country can own the moon. But it doesn't prohibit military activity there. Beijing has tripled the number of its spy satellites in orbit in the last 6 years. And U.S. officials are raising alarms over China's development of counter-space weapons like anti-satellite missiles. Despite the tensions, both nations have some common interests. Intelligence experts say Russia is developing a nuclear weapon for low Earth orbit. That's a threat to U.S. and Chinese spacecraft alike. Leaving aside geopolitics, putting humans back on the moon is essential for future Mars missions. Space experts see the moon as a kind of cosmic gas station, serving as a launch pad because of its lower gravitational pull and, if enough water exists, a source of hydrogen fuel. But space travel is hard to rush. It's dangerous, it's difficult, it's expensive. See the malfunctioning Boeing Starliner that stranded 2 NASA astronauts on the space station until at least early 2025. The more we Earthlings know about the unexplored parts of the moon, the better. Yet, political tensions could hinder the kind of international collaboration that is essential for lunar exploration and beyond. On the other hand, rivalry also spurs progress. China's success could push the U.S. to invest more in space exploration. So maybe it's the perception of competition that will bring the U.S. space program into a new era of discovery. Stakes are out of this world. My guest today is someone who knows that better than most. The only person in Congress who's actually spent time in space and lived to tell about it. Former astronaut and current senator from Arizona, Mark Kelly. We'll get into the space race, private space industry, and the future of U.S. space policy. Here's our conversation. Senator Mark Kelly, thanks so much for being on.
Great to be on. Thank you for the invitation.
You are an astronaut, or have been historically. Can I still call you an astronaut? Is that okay?
You can call me pretty much anything except Scott, which is my twin brother's name.
Who also has been an astronaut.
Who was an astronaut as well. We each flew in space 4 times. I flew 4 times as the pilot or the commander of the space shuttle. My brother flew 2 missions on the space shuttle, once as the pilot, once as the commander of the space shuttle.
This is your identical twin brother?
My identical twin. And then he flew up to the International Space Station on the Soyuz, the Russian rocket and spacecraft, and he ultimately spent a year in space.
So he took the Soyuz up. I mean, is that better or worse than taking a Boeing rocket up these days?
Well, I'm not going to comment on our good friends from Boeing. You know, they've had some challenging times. I flew on the space shuttle, which, in my view, I spent 15 years at NASA. Space shuttle is by far the best spaceship ever built by any country. Without the space shuttle, we would not have been able to build the International Space Station, which is the size of a football field, weighs 1 million pounds. It's now a national laboratory and has provided I think, a great return on the investment. What we've done over the last decade or so since I left NASA was we've transitioned to a commercial cargo and commercial crew program that has brought the cost down dramatically, saving billions and billions of dollars to the American taxpayer and giving us the ability to get to not only low Earth orbit, but higher at a much reduced cost.
International Space Station, enormously exciting that we have that platform and that around the world we have astronauts that are working together there.
Right.
They're in the news because Elon Musk has been asked to put together something that will allow it to be taken out of orbit and destroyed. It's towards the end of its natural lifespan?
Well, it's already beyond what we had planned. We've had crew members on board since 1998. First crew member was Bill Shepard and a Russian. And we have crew members on board today. We weren't planning to operate this continuously forever. And it's beyond its original life. And today it takes more crew time to maintain it than it used to. That number is only going to increase. And if we want to do things beyond low Earth orbit, like go back to the moon and go on to Mars one day, we need the money. You know, NASA has a limited budget, so we can't do both.
How does the space race look different today than you might have expected 5-10 years ago? And I know that the private sector is incredibly involved in driving a lot of what we're doing. Also, of course, the Chinese.
Yeah.
I mean, just saw
that
them.
would be the big part.
Yeah.
I would say, you know, China's engagement in space. They now have a small space station. They've got crew members in orbit now. They just returned a sample from the backside
of the moon, which no one's done before.
Nobody's done. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's hard to do.
Were we surprised?
No, we knew it was coming, but it's something, you know, we haven't tried to do. You know, we are certainly capable of doing it, but it's challenging, and you got to give them credit. I mean, they did something successful that we haven't done before. We're way ahead of China in any space endeavor. We need to make sure we stay ahead. So now I would say our competition is now more China-focused than it was in the 1960s with the Soviet Union. You know, Russia has spent a lot of time and effort in the militarization of space. China's doing the same thing. You know, I sit on the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee. A big concern of mine is, you know, how is the space domain going to be used in any future conflict?
How far behind the Americans are the Chinese? Do we have a decent sense of that at this point?
Well, they've got a goal of, putting somebody on the surface of the moon. I expect we'll be successful with Artemis 3, which is the second crewed flight to the moon that we're working on these right now. We had Artemis 1 a couple years ago, went around the moon, uncrewed.
Unmanned, yeah.
Artemis 2 hopefully will happen next year, sending a crew of 4 around the moon, and then Artemis 3 down to the surface of the moon. I expect we'll be ahead of the Chinese. I don't feel like we're really in a race with them.
I mean, there has been some cooperation, right? I mean, in the sense that, first of all,
with the Russians.
With the Russians. Also, in terms of we have no, militarization of the moon. Nobody gets to have, sort of any claims on it.
So far on the moon.
So far.
I wouldn't put anything, past the Russians or the Chinese with regards to, their, not complying with the treaty. Let's say, 1967, I think it was, the Outer Space Treaty said we're not going to use the moon for military purposes, and nobody owns the moon. I wouldn't put it past, our adversaries to, change their minds.
But how much should we be trying to lean into science and the final frontier to facilitate international friendship in areas where, let's face it, there aren't many of them right now?
Well, we did that with the Russians, right? Hey, every space flight I went on, all 4 of them, were up to the space station. Sometimes I had Russian crew members on board the space shuttle with me, but there were always Russians on board the space station, every flight. And that cooperation worked really well. We got along in space, teams got along on the ground. This tried to help, further a good relationship between our 2 countries. Unfortunately, what Putin did in Ukraine is, I'd say, indicative of, well, did that even matter? But I would say just in general, when we can find ways to cooperate with other countries, especially if it benefits us, and if we could share the cost, certainly with our European partners, with Canada, with Japan, having them as partners in this endeavor has been a huge success for us. They can share some of the burden of the costs. We can help them become spacefaring nations. That part has been a really big success.
So get a little closer to Earth, talk about low Earth orbit. I see there's an area where the Americans are doing an incredible job, but a lot of it is dominated by the private sector.
Yeah, which is good.
Which is good,
right.
If the American government is aligned with those companies.
Sure, which is not always the case.
Which is not the case. So, there's been a lot of stories, right, about the fact that during the war in Ukraine, as you just mentioned, that Starlink decisions on Starlink's operability was being made by their corporate headquarters, not necessarily in alignment with what the U.S. or Ukraine would want. How can the Americans deal with that going forward?
Let me start with saying Starlink has been a tremendous increase in capability, not only for the Ukrainians, to help them in this war against Russia. It's really been a huge advantage, and without it, they would be in a different place than they are today. It's also helped us, and it's something that we're going to continue to work with SpaceX and Starlink on further developing that capability. I'd say in the beginning there were some challenges. How do you prevent another country from getting access to the dishes and the terminals, and they do it through unsanctioned methods. I wouldn't say they're necessarily illegal. They're buying a private product and they're shipping it to Russia and they're using it. That's been a challenge, and I've talked to Elon Musk about this, and they have responded, I think, in a very positive way to do what they can to prevent the Russian government, the Russian military, from using Starlink. Not always successful, but they're doing what they can to mitigate the effects.
What would you say about Taiwan? A place, again, aligned with the United States. U.S. provides a lot of military support. If they don't have fiber capabilities linking them up, then they need communications.
Right.
And whether or not that would be provided by Starlink would be an open question. Should these technologies be fundamentally aligned with controlled by the U.S. government, or is it okay to have some of them fundamentally decided?
Well, I would hope that U.S. companies would be making decisions, that are in, certainly in the best interest of the company and their shareholders, but also, leaning into the fact that these are U.S. companies and there should be some level of patriotism there, and aligning with us and our values. Our adversaries, don't have the same, ethical and moral compass. And I hope that companies, all companies here in the United States would recognize that.
Even closer to Earth, that balloon that was transiting
The Chinese balloon,
Alaska,
Right.
Canada, the United States, eventually knocked down by the U.S. Hotline was attempted to be used. The Chinese didn't pick up.
Right. They often don't.
Tell me a little bit about how you thought about that, responded to it when it was happening.
Well, I mean, it's like any other ISR asset. In this case, much closer to home, and much more provocative. Right. They did that for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
There was some collection that they received from that balloon that they would not have been otherwise be able to get from something in LEO or higher. That's why they did it. And we shot it down. And then we shot down another one. And we can't get in the habit of shooting down every balloon that flies over the United States. I mean, this can get very expensive very quickly. So I've got some legislation, bipartisan legislation, to make sure that at least the balloons that we're launching here from the continental United States and flying over U.S. territory has a transponder on it. Very simple. So we could, so NORAD could say, hey, we don't need to focus on that one. And we don't need to focus on that one. That's a university. That's a company somewhere, U.S. company. We don't need to focus on that. We need to focus on the ones that we really have no information on.
Do we think that the Chinese got that message? I mean, in terms of...
I think they did.
Because there's certainly been a much greater level of military-to-military communication between the U.S. and China.
Well,
post
also,
that
you
incident.
see, I mean, they haven't flown a high-altitude balloon over the United States since we shot that one down.
Yeah. Let me ask a little bit of a silly question, which is I've seen a number of folks in respected media respond pretty alarmist to the UFO testimony. Right. And so I am sure that you found that amusing. Why? I mean, you're going to see conspiracy theory, of course, but why is there so much excitement about this supposed intelligence? Well,
I mean, it's, our galaxy is a big place. The universe is 2 trillion galaxies, and we've got, hundreds of billions of stars and planets in our own. And it's, something people often think about. Is there life out there somewhere else? What is that life like? Does that life visit here? Does visit Earth? I get these questions all the time. People think because I've been to space, like maybe I have this special insight, or maybe I've seen something while I've spent time orbiting the Earth. I haven't. I don't think we've got visitors from other places. Having said that, I've seen some compelling testimony, from Navy fighter pilots. Who, often in one case in a position of leadership in a squadron, that's seen something very compelling. It's our obligation, on the Armed Services
Something
Committee,
compelling, something that he is convinced is technologically not possible by the U.S. or adversaries with this.
In one case, that is true.
Yeah. And what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's our responsibility, if to look into it and put some more resources behind studying these phenomenon. We don't call them UFOs anymore. We call them UAPs. We changed the name.
Unidentified aerial
phenomenon.
Okay, fair enough.
So it's the same thing.
That should make it easier.
It's a UFO.
Yeah.
It's basically.
And is the answer we don't know? At this point, we haven't devoted enough resource to be credible in a response to that.
I don't know if it's a resource issue. It's like, but I think it's fair to say we don't know.
Interesting. Senator Mark Kelly, thanks so much for joining us.
It's been great to talk to you. Thank you.
This week, come back next week, and if you like what you see, or even if you don't, but you've got kids that want to be astronauts, who doesn't? Why don't you take a minute to sign up for our most excellent daily newsletter? It's appropriately titled GZERO Daily.